de gens nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous veillons à ce que les femmes soient prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile, 40% des femmes.
What do you care most when buying color sorters? What makes better sorting performance? What ensures high stability and reliability regardless of 1 unit or 10,000 units? Quality is all. Mayer Smart Factory is built for production of color sorters and dental CBCT. The factory has completed its first phase construction and is the most advanced production base in the industry. Mayer Smart Factory started construction in March 2018 with a construction area of nearly 70,000 square meters and a total investment of nearly $45 million. It takes full consideration of resource conservation, environmental protection, and employee health and safety before designing. The factory takes a multi-layer framed corridor structure, making full use of natural ventilation and lighting. Also, it adopts first-class energy-saving facilities and environmental-friendly materials, making it a true green factory. With the construction concept of first-class equipment and technology for first-class products, Mayer Smart Factory has built over 10 advanced production lines, including the flexible automated production line of dental CBCT, the color sorter assembly line, automatic circuit board SMT production line, unmanned maglev ejector production line, electrical box and sorting box assembly line, which feature high quality, high efficiency, and environmental protection. Mayer Smart Factory delivers a giant leap in stability and reliability. Also, quality of Mayer products is fully upgraded, and equipment maintenance costs are effectively reduced. That makes customers worry-free totally. Quality is all. Mayer is constantly striving towards the goal of, no matter it is to produce 1 unit or 10,000 units, the quality is consistent. In addition, Mayer Smart Factory has reduced material waste from the source for production and become more environmentally friendly, fulfilling Mayer's commitment to environmental protection. Also, Mayer Smart Factory is an important part of Green Mayer, which advocates green design, green production, and green management.
Dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cajou, rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cajou et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cajou du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acalifeevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain ACA vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cajou. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel, situé à Abuja, au Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cajou », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cajou et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cajou du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations.
Thank you very much and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, to this edition of the ACA Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. I hope he's logged on somewhere. Let me first also remind you that we are recording the session, and it's coming also live on Facebook Live and YouTube and on our website. Again, it is in English.
Recording in progress.
There is simultaneous translation into the French language. And then we will also make sure that you have access to the information that we are sharing here at the end of the session. Again, let me mention that this is all possible as a result of support from the USDA GIZ Move, CNFA, Pro Cashew, TechnoServe, Benin Cashew, CMA, CGM, SNI, Maya, and Intersnack Procurement. So thank you very much for all the support in diverse forms. At this stage, I know Jim, you are there if I can see your video. But before I hand over to Jim, let me also mention that today we'll be joined by two interveners. So we have Madame Minata Kone of Sotrabe in Burkina Faso, and then also Tierno Hamidou Balde, Ifa, Guinea. So I see Tierno's video already, and good morning to you. We'll be coming back to you when Jim is done. I see Jim's presentations also. So as always, we bring you all the updates on what is happening across the cashew world, and for you to also make informed decisions about your business. let me mention that there will be a questions and answers Q&A session. So please, you don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A box, or if the chat is convenient for you, then you put it there. We will move it by Jim or by Tieno and Madam in the end. Then also a reminder that we start countdown registration for the ACA 16th edition, which is taking place this time in Nigeria. 15 editions that we have done, the first time in Nigeria. Jim Fitzpatrick
Morning, Ernest.
Presentation. Good morning. How are you? And if you know, you can, and then we invite you in when he is done. Thank you very much. So, Jim, please, you have the floor, and please take over from here. And thank you very much.
Good morning, Ernest. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I hope you're doing well. Today, we're going to talk obviously about the markets, as we always do, and then we're going to step back from that a little bit, and we're going to take a look at a much more global perspective, what I'm calling the people who give us some from the situation, and I'm pleased to welcome them and welcome all of you. This is our 33rd session of this. I hope you're enjoying them. If ever has any suggestions, things you should cover, or particular aspects that you'd like us to look at, feel free to drop us a message. You'll see my number and you'll see my email address on the final slide of today's presentation. I'm introducing, I thought it could be to have a little discussion now and again about what we're talking about in the cashew world. So world is the newspapers and the websites, just to see what stories we're making news cashew sector. And here are a few of them. The first one is from Cambodia. You can see the headlines from the Phnom Penh Post that over 100,000 hectares of cashew trees, actually things and hectares, have been ditched. But it is an interesting story because it shows that there is some reaction in Cambodia to lower prices and perhaps also to higher prices of other products. And you may well find that the growth expected in Cambodia is not as fast, as great as was forecast. More of that later. Another story this week was from Benin, organization called Wadi Cashew, which I think is an Indian organization, has obtained approval for a very large cashew factory. I think it's about 30,000 capacity, a very, very ambitious project. If you think about it, 30,000 tons is about 20% of the crop, and they will be hopefully building their factory very soon. Less optimistic, particularly in India, to be impacted, which is of course true, but probably less true elsewhere, where inflation is less likely to impact cashew demand. I think it also says in that article that the supply this year is likely to be reduced. On a more optimistic vein, from the United States, a story regarding the large price club, a big supermarket, Costco, where consumers are reacting very positively to their product, coconut cashews. I think it's coconut cashews in dark chocolate. Interesting product. And why is it interesting? Well, because it shows different applications of our products in a very mature market in the United States, the second largest market in the world. From Germany, we have a story from Mundus Agri, talking about the concern that cashew traders have at the moment. I mean, they should be concerned. As we'll see in the course of our discussion this morning, there are good reasons to be concerned. I think also traders might be concerned about their role as the markets become more and more integrated. But in this case, it was a question again raised about demand. And generally speaking, in edible nuts, people are asking about demand. I feel there's good reason to be optimistic, and those we'll come back to. From Cote d'Ivoire, a good news story where we see two funds, Nor Fund and Fin Fund, to Scandinavia build cashew processing in Cote d'Ivoire. One projects, one that makes headline news in Africa 21. And finally, a more general story. Really, this one is symptomatic of the times we live in. This is a story from the New York Times. It's not about cashews, it's about almonds, and it's about how stocks, old crop stocks, have mounted up in California. This particular farmer, and farmers are big in California, don't forget that, has a very large stock of old crop almonds lying in the warehouse, not because he doesn't have a market for them, but because he can't get shipping. And the suggestion in the article is that agricultural products are suffering as shipped out of the United States, particularly to China, and particularly, according to a focus on high value products. So there's a range of perspectives. We see cashews making headline news in Cambodia, in India, and then to a lesser extent, much more in the trade press in other countries in Europe and in Africa. Interesting stories. So let's have a look at this week's market indicators and this week's basic trends. First of all, we always look at crops, and the news this week is really pretty much unchanged in Southeast Asia. Cambodia, Vietnam, there's not a great deal of news. The Cambodian Cashew Association has estimated production between 570 and 600,000 tons, perhaps a little bit more than was expected. The crop is definitely down, and it's not clear whether the 15 to 30% reduction spoken of is from that figure or that is the figure. So time will tell. Interestingly, I think as well in that context is that the Cambodian fish exports in the first quarter were about 270,000 tons, whereas Vietnam's recording a much higher import figure. Again, seems to echo the situation that we saw last year. The big news on crops this week or over the last 2 weeks has been that the Indian crop is estimated lower, by some much lower, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Meantime, farm gate prices relatively steady. We see some moving up of farm gate prices in West Africa. In Cambodia, Vietnam, the crops are nearly over there, so there's not really much room for movement. Quality declines. India, again, prices relatively steady. Question marks over the Indian crop. And in West Africa, generally, not touching any particular country, we'll come back to that later. Prices are a little bit firmer over the past 2 weeks. Looking at the international trade, as everyone knows, CFR prices for RCN are steady, higher, a little bit more trade volume. There has been some more activity. I think most newsworthy or most concerning of this is that there appears to be some renegotiation or defaults, depending on which side of the fence you stand, of contracts, and some of the lower price contracts are now, particularly with some of the Vietnamese higher. So generally on prices, we see prices on kernels relatively steady in Vietnam, relatively steady in West Africa, unchanged in India and Brazil. There has been some buying activity since we were last with you, and that's steadied the market rather than push prices up. There is definitely a lot of confusion with regard to prices. Don't forget that, first of all, it's very difficult to understand why prices are as low as they are. There's no arguing this is where they are. Why a question to answer. But also, I think it's important to recognize that there is quite a difference in price between a top-class certified processor, particularly if you want to buy something for a forward position, which most kernels buyers do, and a prompt shipment. And we have to differentiate. When we try to judge the market, we have to differentiate between those two. And that's why I always show a range of prices. So in summary, this week, we see probably more upward pressure on the market, on prices, mostly due to the Indian crop and higher raw cashew nut prices. With regard to demand, as we saw in those newspaper articles, demand is a topic mostly related to fears of inflation, but those are forecasts, guesses at this stage. As we'll see as we go on this morning, the actual impact on demand so far is negligible. So questions about demand of production, the price of raw cashew nuts, buying activity, and of course, costs in the market would tend to push prices upward. So we don't normally look too closely at prices, but I thought it was about time we had a look at prices to try and explain this contradiction between the value of raw cashew nuts and the current price of cashew kernels. So we'll start with farm gate prices, and you'll see here a chart from 2018 through to May 2022. 4 countries, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Vietnam. These are the prices at the farm gate as traded. Some will be low moisture, some will be high moisture, but they're just as traded in each country. The lines aren't continuous because they only cover the season. Naturally enough, there isn't a farm gate market year round. I wanted to have a look at the general trend in farm gate prices. Now, first thing to note is, of course, that prices in India, the purple lines, and in Vietnam, the blue, are much higher than elsewhere. And that is a function of a number of factors. It's a function of local processing. It's a function of high quality, outturn, and size of the nuts. In Africa, distance from the market, because still, despite the growth in processing, most raw cashew nuts move 10,000, 15,000 kilometers to market. That's the reason for price premiums in Asia, but those are not surmountable, of course, for West African farmers. They rely on the development of processing locally and improvements in quality, which can be quite difficult to do, but is possible to improve the farm gate prices. So if we look at the general trends, first India, you'll see that farm gate prices bottomed out in the early part of the pandemic in 2020. This was due to massively reduced processing during lockdowns in India. But since then, prices have moved back up again. Similarly, in Vietnam, we saw prices move back up last year. Now, this year, they're a little bit lower, and that seems to be a function of lower quality. So you've got 2 pressures on Vietnamese cashew growers this year. First of all, you have a poor crop and lower quality. But secondly, you have increased production in Cambodia. So although Vietnamese processors may well welcome the growth of Cambodian production, we shouldn't forget that it's not great news for Vietnamese farmers who may well decide that cashew farming is not for them. And that's one of the key things when we look at our global picture. That's one of the key things we want to look at. Meantime, in West Africa, having bottomed out in 2020, farm gate prices have improved. And what we do see in a small way is a closing of the gap between farm gate prices in West Africa and farm gate prices in Asia. And that really can only be a function of increased processing. So what we're seeing in the market, generally speaking, is a recovery in farm gate prices. India, Vietnam has not moved up in the way that prices in West Africa have moved up. Obviously, prices remain lower in West Africa, but they have moved up. So let's look at the next stage. And we see, first of all, that the farm gate prices have returned to roughly where they were pre-pandemic back in 2018, as the market declined from the high prices of 2017. We're there or thereabouts on farm gate prices around the world. If we look at prices for the international market, so now we're going to look at cost and freight prices, and let's compare where they are compared to 2018. We've already said that farm gate prices have returned to where they were around about this time, May 2018. If we look at the cost and freight prices of RCN, they've moved up generally through this season, and prices are now returned to near enough where they were in the latter stages of the 2018 season. They opened the season very high, coming off the rally of 2017, settled. And then, of course, what we generally see, it always has to be remembered that during a season, we tend to see raw cashew nut prices fall in West Africa, and that's because the quality of the product tends to fall. So prices, we've seen this year upward movement in international raw cashew nut prices, quite volatile upward movement in some origins, particularly Benin, but also in Cote d'Ivoire, also in Burkina and other countries. And this upward movement has been essentially despite the very large transit stock that was held in Vietnam at the early part of the season, estimated at around about 300,000 tons. So what we're seeing is that international prices for raw cashew nuts have moved up more than farm gate prices. They have returned to pre-pandemic levels, and this has been driven by higher costs. We're talking here cost and freight, so the higher freight costs are included. Currency factors, as the dollar has appreciated, and indeed the structure of the market, which has tightened the situation and caused prices to move up. Farm gate prices in West Africa particularly are relatively stable over the past 2 years, but they haven't risen by as much as the international RCN price. And again, we would look at poor infrastructure, the reliance on external financing to buy raw cashew nuts for export trade, and to a certain extent, some of the unclear and in some cases, I would call them unimplementable regulatory policies that we've seen across the sector as governments have come to grips with both the opportunity and the challenge of the cashew sector. I would say that in many cases, the development of processing has not yet had the full impact on West Africa. And that's generally because many processors still tend to source their raw cows through the same traders, through the same channels as the export trade. So we're not seeing any dividend, if you like, for farmers in West Africa that normally you would experience when you see processing develop. We saw that some years ago in Mozambique. We saw it initially in West Africa, and we see it all the time in India and of course in Vietnam. So the impact of processing on the farm gate has not been seen. But in general, what we're looking at is the international raw cashew nut market and farm gate prices moving in the same direction, generally returning to pre-pandemic levels. But that hasn't been the case with kernels, of course. And this is what we might call the great contradiction in the market at the moment. So here we have a chart of 320 prices, the red line, and I've put in splits and large pieces too. And when we look at that, we see that there has been recently an improvement in prices, but we saw quite a crash last October, November, 100% driven from Vietnam. Reasoning behind it, well, not easily understood. If we look at where prices are today, we see that there still remains a gap, and quite a wide gap, between where prices were pre-pandemic. Back in 2018, 2019, prices have not returned to those levels. That's certainly so of 320s, and it is also correct for brokens, for splits and large pieces. Now, it's not as noticeable in the case of splits and large pieces because we have seen a greater rise in prices. We saw a real decline in those grades, in all broken grades, in fact, in the international market. Now, this is the international market, just to underline that it's not including the Indian market, which trades at much higher levels. So what we see is, in general, that kernels prices have not really recovered to pre-pandemic levels, whereas raw cashew nut prices, both at the farm gate and more so in the international market, have. This means lower margins for processors in Vietnam and India, those who rely on imported raw nuts. And you hear regularly, almost daily now, to talk about no parity, so what they mean by that is that the raw cashew nut price doesn't allow them to buy, process, and sell with the profit. This is particularly impactful for Vietnamese processors who are highly reliant on imports. In India, the market is protected to a certain extent. So Indian processors are protected by higher prices in their domestic market, and most Indian cashews are consumed. Most Indian processed cashews are consumed in India, and the whole market is protected by import tariffs on cashews. So if we look at African processors by comparison, African processors have lower supply chain costs. They're maybe $50, $60 a ton distance from their suppliers, and they have a freight cost advantage in shipping kernels to destination markets in the West. So when we look at it and we look at this discussion of no parity, we see that if African processors can come anywhere close to Vietnamese costs, and bear in mind, it can cost as much as $350 a ton to move a product from the farm gate through all the way to Vietnamese processors or Indian processors for that money. But it does mean that African processors, if they can somewhat match the costs of processing in Vietnam, they can become profitable. And we are seeing that in some cases. Vietnamese processors are in a good position now. The largest processors in the Cambodian crop is sold. But once they've dealt with their stock, the Vietnamese crop and the Cambodian stock, they're now exposed to international RCN prices and effectively competition with India. And that's when life becomes more difficult, at least more economically difficult for Vietnamese processors. So just to hold on to that thought, we're going to come back to that a little bit later when we talk more generally of the strategic position in the global cashew market. That's prices, and we see this contradiction, and we see the struggle and the question mark for processors, particularly those with high costs. Let's have a look at consumption and cashew consumers. So we know that our three major markets, India, the largest consuming country, North America, and Western Europe, these are the three major regions for the consumption of cashew nuts. What's going on in those markets? First of all, if we look in Europe, which has been the fastest growing market in recent years, don't forget European imports were up by more than 17% 2 years in a row, and it calmed down a little bit last year, but it has been a very fast growing market. What we're seeing in Europe is some slowing of offtake, and that may be consumers, it may be a case of damaged consumer confidence, probably more for economic reasons than for reasons of the conflict or the war in Ukraine. We have seen that some of the tenders, every spring there are tenders, supermarkets buy set volumes of cashew kernels from roasters. And those tenders were done at very low prices, below today's market. That too is going to undermine confidence to a certain extent. And we're also seeing more integration and more direct sourcing in Europe. So we are seeing changes in the structure of the market. And it's important to understand, I think, that those changes in structure, greater integration in the market, more direct sourcing, some origin value addition, that they may often make it look as if demand is down, but actually what may have happened is that demand has changed suppliers. So it's switched from one set of suppliers to another set of suppliers, meaning that you get these two stories, one saying, well, demand is quite good, and on the other side, well, we're losing demand. It's important to understand the European market has, over the years, been very resilient in the face of recessions, and it's by no means lower imports into Europe this year. If we look at the Indian market, so India is probably the key market in the world, especially now. India suffered big loss in cashew trade, big loss in cashew demand during the pandemic. Demand is now improving again. There is something of a catch-up going on. Social events, weddings, all of these are events where cashews would be consumed, and we're beginning to see this return to normal. So it is quite likely that we will see growth in India returning to normal. Some people are talking about major growth this year. We're using a figure of about 300,000 tons, and I'll show you the implications for that in a couple of slides. One thing to note, I think, in India is that premium kernels are not selling. So premium kernels are the large white hulls, 180s, 210s, even 240s, and that could have an impact on certain supplies of raw cashew nuts, high-priced, high-quality, large nuts from countries like Senegal, for example. It might also focus buyers more on Guinea-Bissau, where they don't get as many large nuts, but they do get very high outturn. If we look at China, we see that the COVID situation is easing. The Chinese government said they will be back to no restrictions early in June. And we also see that imports are up strongly in April from Vietnam, particularly cashew kernels for the Chinese market. Also, tree nut imports in China are quite strong over the year. We're talking about the whole range of tree nuts, and it does look quite strong. You don't tend to get recovery in China. So if you lose first quarter demand, it's lost. The last time that happened, imports hit a figure of 70,000 tons, which was less by 19,000 tons less than, say, last year, which was the all-time record. So Chinese imports will probably be a bit lower than last year, but it does appear that Chinese buyers are coming back to the cashew market. The US market's quite a price-sensitive market, but it's not price-sensitive in the sense of week to week or month to month. There is a period of time it takes for low prices or rising prices to impact on demand. So although there are quite a lot of rumors about the state of demand in the US, I think we have to be very careful who we listen to on this. We have to be very careful because there are short positions. I mentioned that the European tenders were done at low prices. There's two aspects of short positions. One is the fact that you can lose money when the market goes up, but also you could also find yourself effectively short if prices rise and your supplier wants to renegotiate. So you can be short by just needing to buy, but you can also be short by having bought from the wrong people in a rising market. And that may also have an impact this year. We've seen that raw cashew nuts contracts are somewhat renegotiated at the moment. That may not be too far away on some of the very low price kernels contracts too. Meantime, to the US, we see shipments quite strong from Vietnam. And of course, even though prices have moved up, they are still very attractive. There's no doubt that at these levels, cashews make sense for supermarkets and for consumers. And if we look at some of the numbers, so we'll have a look, for example, at US imports. So I tend to look at this time of year at US imports, including December. So we looked at the figures for December through to March. That's because sometimes in December you get high imports that carry into the following year. So we compared December to March 2019-20 last year and the current year. And what we're seeing is a steady increase. We're seeing just under 10% last year, but followed by 9% this year. That's a statement of fact. It doesn't mean it will continue, of course. We don't know. But it is a very strong indication that so far demand looks pretty good. Now, by the end of April, there was a total of 50,000 tons shipped from Vietnam to the US. That probably indicates that imports, at least, will remain strong. If we look in the European market, we see a slightly different picture. So after a very strong start, very high imports in January, as you can see, neither February nor March has managed to match last year. It's by no means disastrous. The 2 months are both ahead of 2020 and well ahead of 2019, just in the general growth trend in the market. But if you were to look at those months in isolation, you might get a very negative impression. If we look at the trend for the year, so this chart has the lines or the cumulative imports month by month over the years starting back in 2017. And you can see each year is higher than the previous year, again indicating the growth. And the bars are the months in 2022. If you look at the bars, you can see it is just marginally ahead of last year. It's 3.14% higher than last year. So overall, what's happened is that high imports in January have compensated the low February and March figures. Looking at February and March, I think I would still expect that the figure for April and probably for May will not be anything spectacular, and that we may be looking at a slowdown in the European market. Having said that, in recent years, it's often been the case that a slow February, March, April, May hasn't actually been indicative of a drop in imports, and it has often been made up later in the year. So if you look back a few years back to 2017, I think this one is, you can see that February and March in particular were poor, but that this was made up for later in the year. And overall, that year was one of the highest growth years in recent history. Good news for African exporters, just put it in as a slight aside. US imports from Africa in the first quarter were up by 55% on last year. That gives, in the first quarter at least, African suppliers about 7.5% share of the US imports, which is significant. The average has been around about 4%, and in actual fact has fallen in recent years. And now we see quarter one 2022, that's moving up again, driven primarily by exports from Cote d'Ivoire. So generally on demand, we see a relatively positive situation based on the numbers, but based on the reports, based on the conversations, there are concerns about the impact of an economic slowdown on the demand for cashews. My feeling is, if we do see that, we won't see the impact of that until the last quarter, or more likely the first quarter of next year. And if some of the economists are correct in their estimations that what we're seeing is what they call stagflation, very short term, high level of inflation, which disappears quickly, we may never see the impact of that on the demand for cashew nuts. So let's move on and have a look at production. As we always do, we'll start in India. So the harvest is now coming in. It's being delivered to processors. Estimates, and we should be very clear, estimates of the harvest in India are often very difficult to make and can often be inaccurate. What people are talking about, or at least what people that I would listen to are talking about at the moment, is a much reduced crop. So somewhere now they're talking between 625 and 675,000 tons, which would be a poor crop by Indian standards. The record crop is in excess of 800,000 tons, and the lowest crop of recent years is probably this 625,000 ton figure. Imports are coming in now in some volume, and it does seem, we'll have a little look at this again in a while, but it does look as if the earlier prediction made that India will import over 1 million tons of raw cashew nuts this year, this could be right. This looks actually now as if it's coming to reality. Cambodia. Cambodia is now the world's third largest grower of cashew nuts. Looks like the crop is definitely lower than expected. The Cambodian Cashew Association is talking about a figure of 570,000 tons. We were talking earlier about a figure of around about 500,000 tons. Still not sure whether the 570 takes into account the decline in the crop this year. It's very well sold at this stage. Most of it has been sold to Vietnam. Cambodia, like many African countries, exports well over 95% of its raw cashew nuts. There is, however, a policy emerging in Cambodia. It's in discussion at the moment and has been for some time to support the development of the sector and in particular to support the development of processing. We do see, and that was highlighted in the article that I mentioned earlier, we are beginning to see strong competition amongst farmers for other products. You know, it's interesting that the Chinese market has opened over the last 3 years for Cambodian fruit, and it's become a boom business. Things like longan, durian, mango, and other fruits, bananas, are all making headway in the Chinese market. Meantime, Cambodian farmers generally have been disappointed with the prices that they've received for their raw cashew nuts. And they've received low prices because they really only have one market. There's no competition in Cambodia. It's only Vietnam that buys the product. There's very little local processing developed as yet. Prices, let's say farmers may have decided to plant cashew trees or planted cashew trees at a time when prices were high and rising, 2016, 2017, and indeed in the early part of 2018. They're now seeing a lower price level for almost 3 years, and that's impacting their decisions. So I'm not saying that people are taking out mature cashew trees, but I think what's happening is that more recently planted young trees that may not even have as yet offered a crop, they may be replaced with other crops. Cassava is mentioned in that article that I highlighted earlier. Looking at Vietnam, at the moment, the imports from Africa are lower than they were last year or in any of the last 3 years. High dependence on Cambodia for supply, and that's turned out to be a pretty good decision, good quality raw nuts at a low price, but the harvest is much lower than expected. Processors, with the low kernel prices that we've talked about and the relatively high prices for imported raw cashew nuts, have been reluctant to move. And what we've seen is that the transit stock, the estimated 300,000 tons, has been reducing. So it looks to me as if the combined Vietnamese and Cambodian crop plus the stock will start to run out in June. And that would be the deadline for more and greater imports from West Africa. And that may be one of the reasons that raw cashew nuts are so well supported at the moment. So in general, we see not too much change in the harvest position. Reductions in India, we kind of expected that. We expected to see that. That appears to be confirmed. And it looks as if demand for raw cashew nuts will be strong for the rest of the year. If we focus in on that Indian situation, I'd said I'd look at this calculation of 1 million tons imports. And you can see, essentially, if we look at this situation, I've used 300,000 tons as Indian demand this year. Some people would say that that's too low. Others might say it's a little bit too high. But if we take that and then we look at the high crop, 675 on the current estimates, and the low crop, 625,000 tons, in either case, imports start to exceed 1 million tons, which would be a new record. The previous high, I think, was 930,000 tons going back some years. So this is significant additional demand. Last year, India imported 873,000 tons, but it also re-exported a significant volume to Vietnam of imported raw cashew nuts. So the net import was somewhat lower. And this year we're looking at quite a significant increase, perhaps in terms of usage, in the order of 15, 20%. Let's have a look at production in West Africa and some of the updates. In Nigeria, not really a great deal of change there. Exports have started. Exports are slower than expected. You can see that in the import figures in India and Vietnam. Processors, I'm told, have bought about 60,000 tons. These reports are courtesy of the African Cashew Alliance reporters and our own trade sources. If you look in Benin, a really interesting case at the moment. It looks like it's about 65,000 tons either gone or ready to ship. Farm gate prices are really very strong, as strong as they've ever been, I think, in Benin. And cost and freight prices are strong. Of course, Benin raw cashew nuts are very much favored in India, and Indian buyers will tend to support prices in Benin. They like the quality, they like the roasting characteristics. Some news this week from Benin, and this is talk rather than confirmed, that they will introduce a new policy, surprising policy indeed, to ban RCN export from 2024. And that is in play at the moment. And that would be quite an interesting development. It would be only the second country of usual exporters to do that, Kenya being the other one. If we look in Cote d'Ivoire, we see farm gate prices have moved up. The quality is declining. That usually happens at this time of year as the harvest moves to more northern areas and the rains come into play. Quality is declining. Reports on the second crop are quite mixed. I don't hear anyone talking about a major problem. I do definitely see higher farm gate prices. If we look at Mali, it looks as if the crop will be lower, but that it has been traded early, and most of it appears to be gone. And there are difficulties with a certain amount of sanctions and security issues, so most traders wanted to move their material out as early as possible. I'm not going to talk about Burkina Faso or Guinea because we have our guests who will give us reports on both of those countries. If we look at Guinea-Bissau, no doubt a good crop coming. This crop could exceed last year. We heard John Rao tell us last week that we could be looking at a crop in the region of 260, 270,000 tons, according to the calculations from last year. We know that buyers are now on the ground. We know that prices are strong. However, we do expect some disruption to shipping. There will only be one container line serving Bissau port this year. Exporters are looking to arrange break bulk shipments. Freight rates are very high. Easy thing to do. And it's expected that there may be some stop-start nature to export from Guinea-Bissau. I think that Guinea-Bissau material will be in particular demand in India for the reasons I mentioned earlier, with the premium nuts not selling. Guinea-Bissau is ideal in that situation where you get fewer of the larger nuts, but more of 320s and below 320s. And finally, a quick look at Senegal. As we heard 2 weeks ago, a good crop is expected. It's high quality, but these high farm gate prices that we discussed 2 weeks ago, those are still in play. And it's surprisingly high prices indeed. It'll be interesting to see how that develops, but it doesn't appear to be indicative of any shortage. The crop is still nonetheless forecast to be a good crop. I think we're also seeing in West Africa, and it's an interesting thing to remember, that across much of West Africa, cashews grow in countries that are linked to the euro. And in those cases, we're more than likely to see more and more interest from European buyers, because you should be able to buy your cashews in euro in Cote d'Ivoire, in Benin, and in any of the other countries where the CFA is used. That also has implications for the RCN market, but it is an interesting factor, and we are seeing increasing interest, particularly from everywhere, but particularly from European buyers and particularly from Eurozone buyers in doing business in West Africa. Finally, a quick look at some of the RCN prices. We see prices have firmed up through the year. I haven't mentioned Ghana today because Ghana pretty much now is dealing with the export of transit stock. The Ghanaian crop is, I think, mostly gone. Quality is lower than expected. Outturn is lower than the typical Ghanaian quality, and we're talking about prices in the range 1350. Benin, as I mentioned, very high prices. These are offered prices. Very high prices being offered there. Cote d'Ivoire's firmed up. Guinea-Bissau starting high, and Senegal starting very high, probably reflecting those high farm gate prices. So when we look at the situation overall, we see certainly some production reduction, certainly reduction on the expectations at the outset, and quite high prices, bringing us back to that contradiction of why are kernels prices so low at the moment. Maybe there's a clue in the supply and demand balance. So I've calculated, for the sake of the conversation, based on global crop starting last October with the Tanzanian crop and the Indonesian crop, a low crop estimate and a high crop estimate. The carry-in, so that's the small carry-in in West Africa, the normal processing stocks with processors, and the high, what I call the transit stock in Vietnam. That's factored in there too. An estimate of demand, which essentially is based on low to no growth in all markets in 2022, with the exception of India, where I've used demand of about 300,000 tons. In terms of world average outturn, I've used 21%, which could be low based on some of the quality reports we're receiving. But that's about average when you take into account outturn and processing losses. That would give us the situation where we have a range. Certainly no major surplus arising. It would appear that on the high crop estimate, that the carryout this year would be about half the size of the carryout last year. In other words, a normal carryout. But if we look at the low crop estimate, we could be looking at a deficit situation. Now, that is not to say for 1 minute that cashew prices are likely to spiral out of control on the basis of a deficit. The cashew market just doesn't work that way. There will be supplies every month coming from West Africa up until July. Then there'll be a gap. And then September, October, the East African, Indonesian, and Brazilian crops will start again. So there will be continuous supply. At the end of the day, though, one thing we could say is there'll be no surplus. Now, there are a few ifs and there are a few factors we always need to consider. The big ifs at the moment, as I see them, would be the size of the Indian crop. Is it the high end of the range? Is it the low end of the range? Or is it something lower again? The eventual outturn of the Ivorian crop, will it make this 1.1 million tons estimate? Indian consumption, probably the most volatile factor of them all right now. The trend in Vietnamese processing, and we'll have a look at that in a minute too. And then the impact of short positions. Who needs to cover? When do they need to cover? How will they cover? And how good is the reliability of the contracts that they've already bought? And we're seeing on RCN renegotiations, if we see that on kernels, it can have an impact of pushing prices. Those are the big ifs. The smaller ifs, in other words, the things that I think probably don't have a huge influence, but are factors to be considered, would be European demand. I'm by no means negative on European demand this year. The continuing rising costs, cost of energy, costs of oil. Most cashews are roasted, many of them in oil. And the Cambodian final crop, I think we have a pretty good idea what it is, but it could be a little bit smaller. It could, of course, be a little bit larger too. So I think we're looking at a very finely balanced situation. In the past, in such situations, we've seen prices move up sharply. I don't see the ingredients for that in 2022. I could see prices steadily building throughout the rest of the year. I don't think that's going to apply to RCN. I think it's already happened for RCN, but we could see kernels prices steadily build throughout the rest of the year. So quite an interesting situation. The unknowns in terms of the fundamentals of the cash market are diminishing as the year goes on. What's happened April, May, June is the time when the stock, the inventory switches from very weak holders, farmers, local traders, into much stronger holders, processors, roasters, international traders of RCN. So you tend to get a firming of the market in that period. That's the current market situation. The second part of the discussion this morning is to try and apply that to the big picture. So we want to focus on the big picture, like these kids looking at a picture in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. So if we look at the big picture in terms of the producers, we have seen that over 30 years, the transfer of production from Asian countries primarily to West Africa, where almost 60% of the world's cashews will grow in 2022. Fact, the two big processors have failed to increase their production. The trends in Vietnam and in India are at best flat, but possibly falling. So we see reduced production in the big processing countries. Cambodia has been the big story. Cambodia has been the hope for additional supply for Vietnam to reduce dependence on distant origins. But it does look on what we're hearing now is that the 1 million tons that was forecast appears to be fading. The availability of inputs, the availability of seedlings, the weather conditions, low prices, the lack of value addition locally, and the surge in interest in other crops, for example, fruit. And there is a question now for Vietnamese farmers who've young cashew trees. Should they grow cashews or should they switch to cassava or fruit? Cassava prices will likely rise this year. Fruit prices, as soon as Chinese imports get back to normal, fruit prices are likely to be quite strong too, and that season is coming very soon. So it does appear that Cambodian initial forecasts, which did not come from Cambodia, by the way, came from elsewhere, forecasts of a 1 million ton crop may be exaggerated, and that we will see, I think, a higher production, but we won't see it at those limits. The impact of Cambodian production is to reduce Vietnamese dependence on African sources and to reduce costs, because it obviously is much easier to move products for maybe $50 a ton from Cambodia into Vietnam than it is to move it from West Africa. Questions for Africa. We're looking at the strategic and fundamental position on production now. So the question really now is, will Africa increase production? And we're particularly focusing on West Africa because that's where production growth has been over the past 20 years. Will production grow enough to meet demand in the future? And that means that prices must be attractive to farmers, that the infrastructure must be able to handle increased volumes. There must be availability of inputs and availability of training. And I think in order to grow production, there must also be an increase in origin processing. And all of that has to be organized in a period where we're beginning to see, or we have perhaps seen for some time, the impact of climate change. And finally, we look at Brazil, where it looks that a recovery in the production of cashews, although it's possible, remains unlikely. So when we look at production worldwide, we're again, as we have been, let's say, momentarily distracted by the huge growth in Cambodia. Longer term, we're again looking at West Africa, to a lesser extent East Africa, for growth in production. So changing the focus to processing then for a moment, you'll all be aware of the relative strengths of the different regions in processing. If we look at their situation, if we go back to the 1970s, we saw processing in East Africa virtually close down and move to India. In the 1990s and in the last decade, we saw again the relative strength in processing move from India to Vietnam, to the point where Vietnam has become the major supplier to markets, particularly in the West, but also China and Australia. Question now is, in this decade, will we see a transfer of processing back west into African countries? And there's reason to think that we're beginning to see that. If, for example, Vietnamese processors are losing money, as they have done in recent years, they will cut their processing volume. If they cut their processing volumes, they won't not affect demand, and consumers will still look to buy those cashews. If we look in India, we see Indian processors well protected by import tariffs, well protected by a fast-growing, high-priced domestic market. In reality, Indian processors would be out of business in the last 5 years if it were not for those two factors. Vietnamese kernels would have poured into India at lower prices. But they are protected, and they're likely to continue to be protected. So the Indian sector, it needs to maybe get more efficient, but it looks reasonably well set to supply Indian demand. The question really is, can African processors use their competitive advantages of being closer to market, for example, being closer to the supply? Can they use that to be competitive? And this is the typical conversation that we're hearing almost every day. You know, we'd love to buy from Africa, but we want a lower price. We want the Vietnamese price. Perhaps sometimes on the buyer's part, without a real understanding that the Vietnamese price is unsustainable and too low anyway. Let's have a look at consumption. Questions on consumption. Firstly, the big question really is, how quickly will India return to pre-pandemic growth rates? Will it happen this year? Will it happen next year? Will it take longer? We've talked about fast growth in Europe, and more recently, we've seen fast growth in the United States. 9% increase, 9.7% increase in imports last year. Hasn't been seen for years. Now it's back to fast growth. The maintenance of growth in those markets is dependent on predictable, relatively stable prices. Not so much the level of price, but the volatility of prices. The sustainability of the supply chain. Food safety. And to a certain extent, price competitiveness. Price competitiveness is obviously important. It may not be the most important thing as time goes on. If we look at demand in China, we've seen consumption growing quickly. Imports have doubled in the past 8 years. Will that continue? What's the likely trajectory for Chinese consumption of cashew nuts? If it gets to a stage, would it be the case that you would see cashew processing plants built in China to import raw cashew nuts from Cambodia or from Africa? That could spread. That could happen critically if demand moves on. Also, there's a question, probably to a lesser extent, because I think to a certain extent we know the answer to this, but to what extent will sub-Saharan Africans consume cashew nuts? It's a question being asked in Cote d'Ivoire, it's a question being asked in Nigeria and in Benin at the moment, where governments and stakeholders in the market are looking to see how they can develop their domestic consumption. It was partly driven by a need to sell brokens, but I think that's probably alleviated now, and the focus on that may drift away a little bit. When we look at consumption overall, and this is a chart which shows, based on pre-pandemic trends over 10 years and over 5 years, that on the current trends, demand will exceed production over the next 10 years. Now, that can't actually happen, of course. Somehow it has to be resolved, either by increased production or perhaps by increased prices. But certainly based on the current predictions, we have to look at our consumption trends, as we've just discussed, in the context of the fact that production growth is just not keeping up with demand. This market needed a bigger Cambodian crop, and it can handle an even larger Cambodian crop, but that will not answer all of the problems. key factor that we need to look at in terms of the strategic position of the cashew business at this moment in time is its sustainability. First of all, we look at the RCN trade, and I mean by this the international RCN trade is represented by the green arrows on the map. It certainly does not meet sustainability goals. If we look at sustainable development goals, the RCN trade does not and probably cannot meet those goals. It is a necessary trade, but it cannot be defined as a sustainable trade. Secondly, if we consider that growing and processing the two together at origin is definitely more sustainable. That's certainly a fact. But there is a question as to whether buyers and especially retailers are really serious about sustainability. Are they just treating it as a branding opportunity, a niche market? Is it a way to justify other activities? What will be the impact of climate change? So there's no doubt that sustainability has a cost, at least in its initial phases. And a lot of buyers, retailers especially, I think need to consider whether they're prepared to pay that price. Third factor, this is something that's really needs to be looked at, in my opinion. The working practices in some cashew processing plants, and particularly in some of the outsourced units. Are they operating within the requirements of buyers? And are they operating within international conventions? Do we check these? As buyers, do we check it? As regulators, do we check it? Do we actually want to know? Maybe we're afraid of what we might find. But it will eventually become a factor. And unfortunately, earlier we highlighted articles from newspapers and websites around the world. Oftentimes in the past, when we've seen the cashew business make the mainstream media, it's often been bad news about labor practices in cashew factories. And there are issues around this. There are issues in some African factories, in Vietnam, and probably in India too. So I think it's important that these issues, which are all threats to the sustainability of the cashew chain. And when we talk about sustainability in this context, it's not just environmental sustainability, but it's also the economic and social sustainability of the industry over time. And there are questions to be asked. And these were accelerated by the pandemic. Supply chain trends and weaknesses in the chain were highlighted. The risk of dependence on single origins, rising costs. We saw freight, but there are other costs too. And now we're seeing even more of that. Transparency and traceability, which is proved to be very difficult in the cashew sector. Shorter supply chains right across the food sector. Buyers are looking for shorter and nearer supply chains. That's become more and more a factor. And the agility of those supply chains. What's their capacity to withstand a shock? You see it at the moment in wheat. You see it in sunflower seeds, with one major producer essentially removed from the market temporarily, Ukraine. The market has to deal with the repercussions of that. So the sustainability of the chain is an important issue, which is going to affect the way we do business in the coming years, and indeed the success of the sector. Also, we see trend toward integration. We talked about more agile supply chains, shorter supply chains, and certainly shorter supply chains with more processing at origin, but only if the infrastructure and the environment, the business environment, allows for that. I think we're certainly going to see more integrated suppliers. We've seen Olam ingredients by a roasting company in Germany. We see traders going into processing. We see companies like Intersnack developing processing in Vietnam to supply their own factories. And we've seen different clues as to how this might happen, but I think we're going to see more of that. And we're also going to see, I think, more value addition at origin. It is one way to manage cost competitiveness issues, is to add more value. So more processing, more development of ingredients, and more development of packing of snack foods at origin. We already see in Vietnam roasting and packing for the Australian market. We're seeing in some West African countries, perhaps on a smaller scale, we're seeing some roasting and export of consumer packs in Mozambique similarly. And also there are examples in India. So the question really, when we look at this strategically and we look at the big picture, is can we sustain the growth? Or are we facing a period of severe volatility, which is, of course, bad for business? And when we look at it, we see that the market has definitely seen unprecedented growth, particularly in demand in recent years and in supply over a slightly longer period. We really need to ask ourselves, is the cashew chain aligned with customers' needs, both roasters, packers, ingredients manufacturers, but also with the consumers? And a big question for African processors is what they call KYC, know your customer. Do you know your customer? And do you manage that relationship? How do you market? How do you manage the relationship with your customers? The second question is, can production rise to meet this expanding demand? Or will we just see a situation where production stagnates in the face of climate change and infrastructure challenges, prices rise, and eventually demand growth slows down? If we do manage to increase production in Africa, will the infrastructure be able to cope with it? And infrastructure means ports, it means processing units, it means food safety, certification, training, all of those areas. And as we know, there are major challenges in all of those areas. And the key thing about increased production is, can the growth in demand, can the sustaining of growth, can it offer to growers a way out of lower incomes? Because if it doesn't, it won't incentivize production. So if we, for example, see an increase in processing, but no impact on farm gate prices or no impact on farm gate relationships, it would be easy to see a situation, as has been seen in Vietnam and in India, where in both cases farmers have said no to increasing production of cashew nuts. They've gone and done other things. We could see the same thing develop in West Africa. So the growth and the development needs to offer growers a way out of lower incomes, better relationships, perhaps with processors. And finally, we need to answer the question, is this kind of growth sustainable, particularly in this time of climate change? So there are big questions strategically for the industry. There are short-term questions like the contradiction in the price of raw cashew nuts and cashew kernels right now, the contradiction in buyers wanting to buy African kernels but not prepared to pay a price in the short term that allows that. And questions about the overall sustainability of the industry. We are seeing some changes already. I think we're seeing the beginnings of the rationalization in Vietnam. Vietnam processors, they won't continue to process cashews if they continue to lose money. We're seeing more direct buying, relationships developing between roasters and even between retailers and processors. We're seeing some factories successful in West Africa, others not so successful. Unsuccessful factories cannot be subsidized forever. So we may see the successful factories take over the unsuccessful factories. We will probably see a slowdown in the growth in production in Cambodia, again, encouraging more rationalization in Vietnam. We may well have seen the peak of Vietnamese cashew processing volume in the last couple of years. Probably we'll see more processing in East Africa too. Definitely there's interesting developments in Tanzania. And we should, I hope, see some cost efficiency in African processing. See how African processing can begin to match the competitiveness of Vietnam as Vietnam rationalizes. That's the big picture. Thanks very much for listening. And I'll pass you back to Ernest for any questions or comments before we go to our guests. Ernest.
Thank you so much, Jim. An excellent presentation of the market situation. I think we will move on and then have the two interveners. I will hand over back to you, actually. But then to remind viewers that if you have any questions, kindly put them in the Q&A or in the chat box. We will pick them up. But then, Jim, so far there are no questions. Everything is very clear, and also particularly what kind of outlook we should be having even in the next couple of years. So I think we wouldn't take much time, but to move straight away into inviting Tieno Hamidou Badi and then Madame Minata Kone. So it's back to you, Jim, to introduce them and then to exchange with them.
Thanks, Ernest. We will start with Tierno Hamidou Balde, who is the Executive Secretary of the Guinea Interprofession. And we'll ask him to give us a summary or a report on the cashew situation in Guinea. Good morning.
Bonjour. Voilà, j'essaie d'activer la vidéo, mais il paraît que c'est bloqué par l'autre. Voilà, je suis Tierno Hamidou Balde, je suis le secrétaire exécutif de l'Inter.
Tierno, we will activate your video very soon.
Yeah, okay, so nice. Voilà, merci. Donc, comme je le disais tantôt, je suis Tierno Hamidou Balde, secrétaire exécutif de l'interprofession de la filière anacarde Guinée, qui regroupe l'ensemble des acteurs de la chaîne de valeur, les producteurs, les commerçants, y compris collecteurs, les exportateurs et les transformateurs. Je pense que cette année, la filière se porte beaucoup plus mieux que l'année dernière, où les quantités exportées étaient assez faibles et la pandémie de Covid avait eu un impact négatif assez significatif. Et heureusement, cette année, la tendance est beaucoup plus stable depuis le démarrage des opérations de commercialisation. Et ce que je puisse vous dire, le prix bord champ a été fixé à 6 000 francs guinéens. Et voilà, approximativement 6,5 $. Bon, je ne connais pas l'équivalent en francs CFA. Donc, c'est ce travail qui a été fait. Et comme vous le savez, la chaîne de valeur, tout le mécanisme d'exportation dépend d'un certain nombre de facteurs que M. James a bien voulu détailler tout à l'heure lors de ses différentes présentations. Donc, nous sommes dans une approximation de près de 200 000 tonnes de noix de cajou au niveau pour la situation pour cette année dans le cadre de l'export. Mais il faut juste savoir que ce chiffre se heurte souvent, peut-être comme dans beaucoup de pays, à certaines volatilités qui sont notamment liées au transport par voie terrestre de certaines noix de cajou. Ça peut être dit souvent à la venue d'acheteurs étrangers des pays limitrophes, mais ça peut aussi être dû à la qualité des infrastructures, parce que nous sommes dans un pays à forte pluviométrie. Donc, quand la pluie arrive et que les infrastructures routières ne peuvent plus assurer le transport des cajous, les gens s'orientent vers les zones les plus faciles et souvent, c'est dans les pays limitrophes. Donc, ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, en termes de statistiques assez fiables, on va vous donner peut-être ce qui est exporté par le port, mais la production locale elle dépasse largement cela, vu que vu qu'il y a déjà une unité industrielle de transformation du cajou, même si sa capacité est faible, qui est de 10 000 tonnes par an. Mais il y a des grandes perspectives qui sont en cours. Il y a une nouvelle unité qui est en train d'être construite dans un autre bassin de production. Il faut rappeler qu'en Guinée, il y a deux principaux bassins de production. Il y a la région de Boké et la région de Kankan, la région de Farana qui généralement s'ajoute à la région de Kankan. Et donc la première unité, elle est à Kankan, la seconde va être à Boké. Donc il y a d'autres perspectives en cours, mais ce sont L'unité qui est 100% opérationnelle, c'est celle de Cancan. Et celle de Bokeh, les travaux sont en cours. Donc, il y a un autre opérateur aussi qui est en train de mettre une autre usine. Donc, il y a 2 unités qui sont en train d'être mises en place. Et par rapport à la quantité exportée cette année, comme je vous le disais, généralement, c'est en fin de campagne, on fait la situation, même si il y a des déclarations qui sont pratiquement gérées par les autorités, notamment l'Agence guinéenne de promotion des exportations. Donc, ce qui fait que souvent, c'est vers la fin, après que le rapport est établi, qu'on puisse avoir cela. Les seules difficultés qu'on rencontre souvent, comme je l'ai dit tantôt, c'est au niveau de la logistique, au niveau de certaines lourdeurs administratives. Je pense qu'on a fait un plaidoyer tout récemment pour qu'il y ait un guichet unique et un mécanisme beaucoup plus allégé pour faciliter la fluidité et le transport des produits, mais aussi la mise à disposition des acteurs, des humidimètres pour permettre d'évaluer l'humidité des produits, parce qu'il arrive souvent que c'est au niveau des clients à l'usine, c'est-à-dire qu'on essaie de connaître l'humidité du produit, donc le taux d'humidité. Donc l'idée, c'était de voir comment mettre tout ça à la disposition des gens. Pour améliorer la qualité du produit, nous avons procédé à la remise de quelques bâches pour le séchage et des conseils en la matière pour aider à améliorer la qualité de la production. Donc, pratiquement, ce sont ces petites difficultés qui se posent. Au niveau de la commercialisation, comme vous le savez, c'est un peu plus facile pour le volet commercialisation que la production, parce que ceux qui font de l'export avec des contrats et des lettres de crédit, ils ont la possibilité d'avoir des lignes de crédit. Et le mécanisme qui est souvent développé chez nous ici, c'est la tierce détention. Donc, il y a des entreprises de tierce détention qui sont en Guinée, qu'on utilise souvent comme warrantage pour être le lien entre la banque, l'exportateur et comment on appelle ça, et le client qui a commandé les produits. Donc, voilà un peu le mécanisme qui est mis en place, mais les coûts d'appui au niveau de la banque, les taux sont toujours les mêmes, c'est des banques commerciales. Donc, voilà un peu ce qui se passe au niveau de la Guinée. La transformation, comme je vous l'ai dit, la quantité, c'est 10 000. Mais depuis que l'unité a été mise en place, elle n'a pas encore atteint les 10 000, comment on appelle ça, les 10 000 tonnes. Parce que vous savez, la saison des anacardiers, c'est une période donnée. Après, il faut s'arrêter. Donc, il faut que l'usine ait une capacité d'acheter 10 000 tonnes de noix de cajou pour les stocker et ensuite procéder à la transformation. Et ce qui n'est pas très, très évident, parce que 10 000 tonnes de noix de cajou, d'abord, c'est vrai qu'il y a l'espace logistique et tout, mais il y a les ressources financières aussi qu'il faut mobiliser. Donc, il y a ces différentes difficultés qui font que l'usine n'est pas en plein régime, elle n'a pas encore atteint, je crois, les 10 000 tonnes, même si elle se rapproche. Mais c'est lié à cette difficulté que je viens de mentionner. Il faut stocker 10 000 tonnes de cajou pendant toute la période pour pouvoir les transformer, parce que la transformation, c'est toute l'année. Donc, voilà un peu les difficultés auxquelles la transformation est confrontée. Donc, il y a des mécanismes qui sont en train d'être négociés pour qu'on ait un fonds d'appui, d'accompagnement de la transformation pour renforcer davantage les capacités d'absorption des unités de transformation pour qu'elles puissent s'approvisionner en matières premières pour la quantité souhaitée, qu'elles puissent conduire les activités de transformation dans les meilleures conditions. Donc, voilà un peu comment est-ce que cela se passe. Et chez nous, en Guinée, comme je le disais tout à l'heure, les discussions sont en cours avec l'interprofession, le ministère du Commerce et celui de l'Agriculture, pour voir quel est le mécanisme qu'il faut mettre en place, parce qu'il y a une cotisation que les exportateurs payent sur la tonne, il y a une partie de ce montant qui, en principe, doit contribuer au développement de la filière. Et on est aussi en train de voir tout l'aspect administratif, tout l'aspect loi pour pouvoir davantage renforcer le développement de la filière. Donc, lors d'une réunion dans la région de Bokeh, pendant le lancement de la campagne de commercialisation, il y a des recommandations qui ont été faites et un comité est mis en place. Nous sommes en train donc de travailler pour identifier les différentes difficultés et essayer de les traduire en recommandations et voir avec les autorités gouvernementales quels sont les dispositifs pérennes et durables qui peuvent être mis en place pour améliorer la productivité, pour améliorer la compétitivité de la filière de la noix de cajou en Guinée. Et il faut rappeler que chez nous, en Guinée actuellement, on ne travaille que sur la noix de cajou. Donc, il n'y a pas une industrie très développée de la pomme. Donc, toutes les pommes récoltées sont généralement abandonnées sous le pied de l'arbre. Il n'y a que des petits groupements qui font de la transformation, mais elle n'est pas aussi importante. Donc, toute l'industrie du cajou aujourd'hui est focalisée sur la noix de cajou. Voilà, la transformation en amande ou l'exportation. Et les pommes de noix ne sont pas beaucoup exploitées. Souvent, c'est dû à la faible connaissance des techniques de transformation de la noix de cajou. Donc, voilà un peu de façon ramassée la situation actuelle en République de Guinée. Et je reste disponible pour me prêter aux questions des uns et des autres. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much indeed. It's interesting to see the sector in Guinea develop. I think before we come to any questions, let's ask Koni Manata from Burkina Faso, the CEO of Satrea Bay, but also a past president of the Association of the Cashew Business in Burkina Faso, to give us a picture of the situation in Burkina in the cashew sector in 2022. Kone Imanata, are you there?
As we wait for Madame Kone to join Jim, just one question for Tieno. As to the policy environment in Guinea today, if Tieno can hear me, I'm just coming in as we wait for Madame Zinata Kone, just to find out what is the policy environment like today in Guinea. What kind of policies are being implemented by the government, and then whether also there is a regulatory structure, and what is the participation of the interprofession in all these policy-making issues.
Voilà, et je commence par la dernière question par rapport au niveau de participation. C'est qu'ici, en Guinée, au début de chaque campagne, il y a l'interprofession qui se retrouve avec l'Agence guinéenne d'exportation, de promotion des exportations, la Direction nationale du commerce intérieur, qui relève tous du ministère du commerce, de l'industrie et des petites et moyennes entreprises, pour ensemble définir un document qu'on appelle un arrêté de commercialisation, à l'intérieur duquel document on a un certain nombre de mesures, de conditions pour être collecteur, pour être exportateur, pour être transformateur. Donc tout cela est défini de commun accord avec le gouvernement. Et par rapport à la fixation du prix Borchamp, c'est en principe l'interprofession qui fait une proposition. Dans l'interprofession, puisqu'à l'intérieur de l'interprofession, il y a l'Association guinéenne des exportateurs d'anacarde. Donc, en concertation avec eux, en concertation avec comment on appelle ça, la Fédération nationale des producteurs et tous les autres acteurs, toutes les autres parties prenantes, nous proposons un prix Borchamp qui est discuté ensemble, mais ce prix Borchamp doit refléter les réalités par rapport à une grille de fixation du prix Borchamp qu'on utilise, qui part du prix Borchamp jusqu'au prix FOB ou CAF, donc en définissant les différentes marges de chaque acteur et de chaque niveau, et en tenant compte des cotisations, comment on appelle ça, et aussi de la contribution ou des coûts liés à l'accompagnement des banques à la filière exportation. Donc, c'est à partir de cet élément qu'on fixe le prix Borchamp, le prix minimum Borchamp, et les autres articles qui composent cet arrêté de commercialisation. Une fois c'est validé à travers plusieurs consultations, en ce moment, nous transmettons par voie officielle s'il y a des nouveaux éléments qui doivent être intégrés, nous essayons de, comment on appelle ça, de mettre ça à la disposition du ministère par voie de courrier officiel. Ainsi, ces commercialisation qui est signé par le ministre et diffusé vers tous les autres acteurs. Donc, au niveau du niveau de participation, on est vraiment impliqués ensemble. Ce qui concerne la filière, généralement, le ministère ou les acteurs politiques nous demandent de faire des projets puisque nous sommes ceux qui sont directement impliqués. Maintenant, par rapport à la politique, comme je le dis, c'est une politique d'inclusivité qui, en principe, est évolutive. C'est en fonction d'une situation. Quand il y a des recommandations, si ça nécessite qu'il y ait un arrêté interministériel, c'est-à-dire qu'il regroupe 2 ou 3 ministères, en ce moment de travail, sur l'anacarde, voilà, comme dans d'autres pays, il y a des lois cadres sur l'anacarde. En Guinée, pour le moment, il n'y en a pas, mais nous sommes en train de travailler dessus. Il n'y a pas une agence de régulation spécifique à la filière anacarde. Donc, toutes les filières d'exportation sont appuyées par l'Agence guinéenne de promotion des exportations. Donc, il y a plusieurs services autour, mais il y a une entrée unique qui permet, avec le fait qu'il y ait un interlocuteur unique des acteurs de la filière anacarde, ça nous permet d'avoir des discussions avec les acteurs du ministère de l'Agriculture, du Commerce, de l'Industrie, des petites et moyennes entreprises, pour enfin harmoniser nos idées et de proposer quelque chose qui puisse être non seulement bénéfique aux acteurs, mais aussi bénéfique qui fonctionne actuellement. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. Jim, I think you can take over with him, as Madame Kone's line is still difficult because of the internet problem.
Okay, sorry to hear that. Tierno, can I ask you a question? How do you see the long-term trend? How do you see the long-term trend in production?
Bon, sur le long terme, ce sur quoi nous sommes en train de travailler, par exemple, c'est sur des projets de développement de la filière, parce qu'il faut reconnaître qu'il n'y a pas eu de programme structurel en Guinée encore pour accompagner la filière anacarde. C'est vrai qu'il y a eu des initiatives présidentielles qui ont consisté à mettre à la disposition des populations des semences et de l'engrais, mais on n'est pas allé loin, on n'est pas allé dans un mécanisme de professionnalisation, de formation de ces différents producteurs, ce qui fait qu'aujourd'hui, on a un important verger d'anacardier, mais la production à l'hectare est très faible parce que les gens n'ont pas assez de connaissances. Donc, les producteurs se battent à la hauteur de leurs moyens, à la hauteur de leur compréhension pour pouvoir produire quelque chose. Et nous, en tant qu'interprofession, nous essayons de mettre à la disposition de ces différents acteurs le maximum d'informations pour les permettre d'être compétitifs et de respecter les normes minimales pour que le produit soit de bonne qualité. Et l'idée aujourd'hui, c'est d'aller vers des programmes de développement. Et les discussions sont déjà en cours pour accompagner la chaîne de valeur. C'est-à-dire, à partir de la production, un diagnostic qui a été fait, c'est d'adresser une réponse par rapport à ces problèmes identifiés. La même chose au niveau de la commercialisation. Quel est le mécanisme qu'il faut mettre en place pour relever les différents défis identifiés? Et au niveau de la transformation, nous nous battons pour qu'il y ait un fonds d'accompagnement de la transformation. Parce que je vous ai dit que c'est une saison, l'anacarde. Donc, quand on met les unités de transformation, il faut que l'unité ait la capacité. Si c'est une unité de 20 000 tonnes, capacité de transformation de 20 000 tonnes, il faut qu'elle ait la capacité de stocker 20 000 tonnes de noix de cajou pendant la période de production, pendant la campagne, pour pouvoir ainsi être toujours avoir la disponibilité de matières premières et renouveler le stock avec un mécanisme qui permette à l'unité de tourner durant tout le cycle annuel. Donc ça, les transformateurs ont besoin d'accompagnement. Et l'accompagnement ne se limite pas juste au niveau du financement, mais il faut aussi aller vers la certification de ces unités de transformation pour qu'elles puissent être compétitives au niveau mondial, puisqu'on n'a pas un marché local assez développé en Guinée par rapport à la consommation des amandes du cajou. Et comme je vous l'ai dit tantôt, la filière, elle est un peu, on utilise, disons, une seule partie des produits de la filière, qui sont les noix de cajou. Et les pommes aussi, nous sommes en train de travailler sur un autre mécanisme pour pouvoir fournir assez de moyens logistiques et de connaissances à ces petits producteurs pour que ces petits producteurs puissent, au-delà de produire des noix de qualité, mais aussi de transformer les pommes de cajou. Donc, les perspectives actuelles sont basées sur cela et on a contacté des partenaires pour travailler sur des projets de 3 ans et de 5 ans. Les discussions sont en cours et les premières notes conceptuelles sont en train d'être en fait rédigées pour pouvoir aller vers une professionnalisation de la filière, une pérennisation et un renforcement, comme je le disais, de la compétitivité.
Merci, Tierno. We had a slight problem with our interpretation there, I think. At least I could not hear the English interpretation. I hope that isn't too inconvenient. But it is interesting and constructive to see the role of the interprofessional organization in developing the sector, particularly in a country where there generally isn't a regulatory framework specifically for cashews at this time. Okay, it looks as if Madam Kone is not going to be able to join us. So, Ernest, are there any questions? We've gone over our time as usual, but are there any questions?
From here, there are no questions, though, but then I know that he has also addressed the issue of the tendencies in terms of the trends in the prices. And but then the other area would have been whether he has any estimates on the inflows from Guinea-Bissau and Mali, from the neighboring countries into Guinea, or from Guinea out of the country into the other countries in the neighboring parts of their countries, whether from Guinea to Guinea-Bissau or to any other country, whether he has those estimates.
Tierno?
Oui, voilà, par rapport à cela, comme je vous l'ai dit, chez nous, par exemple, l'arrêté de commercialisation dont je faisais état tout à l'heure, on a défini dans cet arrêté que les collecteurs sont des personnes physiques de nationalité guinéenne. Donc, quelqu'un ne peut pas, en principe, comme je le dis, en principe, quitter notre pays pour venir être collecteur sur le marché guinéen. Donc, maintenant, les autres sont ouverts à tout le monde, c'est-à-dire qu'un exportateur, un commerçant, qui peut venir prendre la carte de commerçant, s'établir. Mais les cartes de collecteur et de pisteurs sont remis à des individus, à des personnes physiques qui ont la nationalité guinéenne. C'est pour éviter cette concurrence déloyale, parce que si les gens partent dans les villages pour acheter avec des francs guinéens et que d'autres viennent d'autres régions, viennent acheter avec une monnaie dont la valeur est plus supérieure, convertie au prix borchant, ça devient un peu difficile parce qu'en ce moment, on perd toutes les quantités qui transitent par voie terrestre parce qu'elles ne sont pas comptabilisées. Et déjà, c'est interdit dans ce même arrêté l'exportation par voie terrestre de ces différents produits d'exportation. Parce que si on le fait, généralement, ce n'est pas des voies autorisées qui sont utilisées. Donc, le pays perd toutes les quantités qui sortent par voie terrestre. Donc, ce problème, chaque année, on rencontre des gens, même pas des pays limitrophes, même des Chinois qui viennent, qu'on retrouve qui deviennent des collecteurs, qui vont, ou des Indiens qui vont dans les villages pour acheter les noix de cajou. Donc, il a été clairement dit au niveau de la Guinée que les collecteurs, ce sont des personnes. Voilà, ce sont des personnes physiques de nationalité guinéenne qui peuvent obtenir la carte de collecteur et de pisteur. Maintenant, les cartes de commerçants, d'exportateurs, c'est ouvert à toute personne morale légalement établie en Guinée. La personne soit légalement établie en Guinée pour qu'elle puisse avoir cette carte de commerçant, d'acheteur et d'exportateur pour pouvoir exercer sur le sol guinéen. Seulement les collecteurs et les pisteurs qui sont réservés à des personnes physiques de nationalité guinéenne. Voilà un peu comment ça se passe en Guinée.
Thank you very much. Jim, let me alert you that Madame Kone is now connected, and also to apologize to our listeners for the challenges with the French translation. It's back on, and thanks for your patience.
Madam Kone, would you like to tell us the situation in Burkina Faso? You're very welcome. Glad to have you online with us.
Jim, I'm informed that her connection is gone off again. So
Okay.
I think we just will finalize without her and then invite her for another session. So please go ahead. Yes.
Okay, well, I hope she can join us for another session. We'd be very interested to hear about the situation in Burkina. Well, I just like to thank you all very much for attending today. And I would also like to say that when we look at some of these longer term trends and we look at the big picture, so to speak, probably the most important lesson really for us all is that we should think long term when it comes to the cashew sector. It is easy to be distracted by short-term trends and the apparent lack of viability of certain aspects of the business. But at the same time, we have gone through a period of, as I said, unprecedented growth, and it does appear that that is likely to continue. So on that optimistic note, we leave you today. Thanks very much indeed for your time. It's my pleasure. I would encourage anyone who has any further questions or who would like to talk cashews, feel free to contact me. You can see how to contact me on the screen, or of course, contact the African Cashew Alliance. Thanks very much indeed, and I'll hand you back to Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you also, Diego. And it's been a pleasure having you from Guinea. And we have learned a lot from there. We know that we'll be inviting you again. But Jim, don't leave yet because we still want from you what to expect in the next fortnight. So thank you so much, Tieno, and talk to you another time. And to our participants, please, we want to hear from Jim shortly what to expect in the following week, and then I'll hand you over to Les.
Okay. Well, I expect the last 2 weeks in May. I don't think it'll be particularly eventful in terms of price movements on raw cashew nuts. I think we will see more trade in raw cashew nuts. We will certainly see a lot of negotiation. We'll see a bigger focus on Guinea-Bissau, I suspect, and we'll see great competition in Guinea-Bissau this year, but that all has to be managed within the context of difficult logistics. On kernels, this time of year is not a particularly difficult or a particularly busy time for kernels, but it can be a difficult time in the kernels market. It can be a time over the next 6 to 8 weeks when processors realize that some of their earlier decisions are working out, and that can cause a certain amount of volatility in the market. My feeling is that prices will remain relatively steady. I suspect we will see reduced processing in Vietnam and therefore opportunity processors elsewhere. Big thing to look out for, I think, is reports from India. Look out for how the Indian demand is faring as we come through to the end of May. I think that is really a crucial factor. Look out for the activities of Indian processors buying in the market. Crop-wise, I think we pretty much know where we're going this year now on the crops. I'd be keeping an eye on the situation in Côte d'Ivoire as the season moves towards its conclusion. And I would keep a close eye on the news coming from India in terms of how that harvest is developing. There still is quite a lot of time left in the Indian harvest, and that should be watched very closely. So I don't expect a particularly volatile period. It'll be, as always, it'll be an interesting period, and it needs to be watched closely. I don't think it's a time for speculation. I don't think it's a time for taking big risks. I think it's a time for managing risk, and we do live in a volatile political situation, and that too could have an influence in the market. But I would say that appears to be settling a little bit. Look for big impact on commodities, on products like wheat, for example, grains in general, proteins, but don't necessarily expect what's happening in those commodities to happen in cashew nuts. It's very, very different sectors. With that, I'll hand you back to Blessing. Thank you very much indeed. I look forward to seeing you the next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, James Fitzpatrick, once again, and also special thanks to our participants, interpreters, contributors, and apologies once again on the French translation. So Lessons, please take over from here and tell us whatever information is there, particularly also regarding the upcoming conference. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you very much, Ernest, Jane, for another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter. And thank you to Theonora for joining us all the way from Guinea. To all our partners and sponsors, CNFL Pro Cashew, GIZ Move, TechnoSelf Benin Cashew, Maya, SNI, Intersnack, and to all our participants, thank you for joining us again today. The next session of the Global Market Encounter will be held on the 1st of June, 2022. Please mark your calendars and join us again. We are happy to announce that the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo will be held in Abuja, Nigeria, from the 12th to the 15th of September. Registration has started. Visit acaliveevent.com. I repeat, visit acaliveevent.com and take advantage of the early bird rates. Register now. See you again on the 1st of June. Bye-bye.
Recording stopped.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acaliveevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, ACA, vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cashew. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel, situé à Abuja, au Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cashew », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cashew et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement, pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cashew du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acaliveevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le Cashew africain, ACA, vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cashew. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel, situé à Abuja, au Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cashew », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cashew et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement, pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cashew du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acalifeevents.com to register.
L'Alliance pour le cajou africain ACA vous présente la 16e conférence et exposition annuelle sur le cajou. L'édition de cette année se tiendra du 12 au 15 septembre à Sheraton Abuja Hotel situé à Abuja, Nigeria. Sous le thème « Renforcer le marketing durable des amandes et des produits dérivés dans l'industrie africaine de la noix de cajou », rejoignez les acteurs de l'industrie du cajou et les partenaires de développement du monde entier, soit en présentiel ou virtuellement, pour assister à des séances plénières, des présentations et des débats d'experts du cajou du monde entier.
The African Cashew Alliance ACA presents to you the 16th ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo. This year's edition will be held from the 12th to the 15th of September 2022 at the Sheraton Abuja Hotel, Abuja, Nigeria. Theme: Strengthening Sustainable Kernel and Byproduct Marketing in the African Cashew Industry. Join cashew industry players and development partners across the globe, physically or virtually, for insightful plenaries, presentations, and panel discussions from cashew experts across the globe. Visit www.acalifeevents.com to register.